In the years leading up to the Black Death, Europe was a world full of promise, despite its many hardships. Life was often difficult, but there was also a sense of steady rhythm that shaped the daily existence of the people. The land was fertile, the seasons marked by the planting and harvesting of crops. Villages and towns hummed with the constant motion of work, of farmers tending fields, bakers kneading dough, blacksmiths hammering metal, and merchants carrying wares to and fro. Life in medieval Europe, especially in the early 14th century, was defined by an enduring connection to nature and the land. People lived by the seasons, deeply intertwined with the earth beneath their feet. There was an unspoken harmony in this way of life. Everything had its place, and the world, though rough and often unpredictable, had a sense of stability. Cities like Paris, Florence, and London were centers of commerce, filled with the bustle of traders from across the continent and beyond. The rise of towns and cities during this period reflected a greater interconnectedness between regions that hadn't existed in centuries prior. This was a time of cultural and economic exchange, of new ideas, and the beginnings of a shared European identity. For all the hardships that life in the Middle Ages imposed on the people, there was a steady sense of forward movement. But nothing could have prepared them for the force that was quietly emerging on the distant horizon, a force that would disrupt the entire social fabric and change the world forever. Europe, despite its economic and cultural advances, was still a land bound by the chains of feudalism. The structure of society was built on the idea that the land belonged to a few powerful lords, and those who worked the land, peasants, were tied to it. This medieval social system, though time-worn, remained the backbone of much of life in the early 14th century. The Catholic Church was the ultimate authority in the lives of most Europeans. It dictated not just the spiritual aspects of life, but the political and moral as well. The Church, with its vast wealth and power, shaped how people viewed themselves and their relationship with the world. It taught them that their purpose was defined by a higher power, and it was through devotion to God that one could secure eternal salvation. But the Middle Ages were also a time of change. The 14th century had witnessed the rise of trade, exploration, and a growing urban class. Cities became the focal points of European economies, attracting more people who sought the opportunities that the bustling marketplaces offered. The Venetian and Genoese merchants were now traversing the Mediterranean, linking the West to the Islamic world and Asia. These merchants brought with them goods, knowledge, and ideas from the far corners of the earth, new ways of thinking and understanding that would soon collide with the cataclysm of disease. However, this expanding world was far more fragile than it appeared. Europe, by the 14th century, had become a web of interconnected cities, towns, and kingdoms. The vast network of trade routes stretched across the continent, linking kingdoms from the north to the south and the east to the west. At the heart of this network were the great trading cities, like Venice, Genoa, and Florence, which functioned as cultural and economic crossroads. They were connected to the Mediterranean, and beyond it to Asia. These cities were bustling with life. They were where East met West, where ideas, goods, and cultures collided and fused. The great markets saw silk from China, spices from India, and precious metals from Africa all arriving at the same time. The Middle East acted as an intermediary, bringing goods from the Asian mainland through the vast trading empires of Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Byzantine Empire. However, along with the precious goods that passed through these cities, so too did something far more dangerous: disease. It was in this interconnected world that the seeds of disaster were quietly sown. The story of the Black Death does not begin in the heart of Europe, but rather on the vast steppes of Central Asia. There, far from the teeming streets of Venice or London, a deadly force was quietly taking shape. The culprit was a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that infested the bodies of rats. This bacterium had existed for centuries, but it had not yet found the right conditions to spread as it would. The Mongol Empire, which spanned from the eastern reaches of China to the Mediterranean, played a critical role in the spread of this disease. The Mongols, known for their vast and powerful empire, maintained extensive trade and communication networks that spanned across Eurasia. It was through these trade routes, often referred to as the Silk Road, that Yersinia pestis found its path into Europe. The first signs of the plague emerged in the early 1340s in the region of the Black Sea, around modern-day Ukraine. It spread quickly through the port cities along the coast, carried by ships that docked in the Mediterranean and in the bustling trade cities of Italy. The year 1347 marked the first official encounter with the plague in Europe. In the city of Kaffa, in Crimea, it is said that Mongol soldiers, who had been besieging the city, fell ill with strange and violent symptoms. The disease quickly spread among the besieging army, and when the Mongols realized that their soldiers were dying, they attempted a desperate and gruesome act. They catapulted the bodies of the dead into the city. This act of biological warfare was likely one of the key moments that accelerated the spread of the disease. From Kaffa, the disease spread rapidly along the trade routes. It was carried by ships to Sicily in 1347, and from there it began its deadly journey into the heart of Europe. The disease made its way to the bustling ports of Italy, Genoa and Venice, and then spread to the rest of Europe. The plague didn't waste any time. Within months of its arrival in Europe, it had begun to ravage entire communities. Cities like Florence, with their tightly packed streets and unsanitary conditions, were especially vulnerable. The initial symptoms of the plague were horrifying: fever, chills, and swelling of the lymph nodes. The swollen lymph nodes would often turn black and necrotic, leading to the name bubonic plague. People, in their ignorance, were utterly unprepared for the scale of what was happening. Some feared that the disease was a punishment from God, sent to cleanse the world of sin. Others believed it was caused by bad air or supernatural forces. The church, which had been the center of spiritual life, could offer no explanation. For many, the plague was a mystery, a force that could neither be fought nor understood. In the early days of the plague, there was confusion and panic. As the disease spread, some communities took desperate measures, shutting themselves off from the outside world, locking gates and bolting doors in an attempt to keep the disease out. Others fled, abandoning their homes in a vain attempt to escape the invisible enemy that was taking over their world. As the disease spread across Europe, it became clear that the Black Death was unlike any other illness. It spread with terrifying speed, leaving little time for medical professionals or religious leaders to offer any real comfort. The people of Europe were desperate for answers, but there were none to be found. The familiar structures of medieval society, community, religion, and even reason itself began to crumble under the weight of the catastrophe. The response from the church was one of prayer and penance. Clergy called for fasting, processions, and penitence. But the plague did not relent, and as the death toll climbed, even faith was not enough to comfort the suffering. In some areas, people turned to extremism, blaming Jews for the spread of the disease and accusing them of poisoning wells. In an act of appalling violence, entire Jewish communities were wiped out in brutal pogroms. Despite the best efforts of governments, city councils, and local leaders, the disease spread unchecked. The medieval world had no means of understanding disease transmission. There was no concept of germs, bacteria, or viruses. Quarantine measures, though introduced in some places, were little more than symbolic gestures. The Black Death would continue its ruthless march, claiming the lives of millions. The Black Death, once a distant specter, had now swept across Europe with a ferocity no one could have predicted. As the months passed, it left behind a landscape of devastation, empty villages, deserted cities, and broken families. The familiar world of bustling markets and lively streets had fallen silent. What had been teeming with life now seemed hollow, as the death toll mounted and the survivors, dazed and uncertain, tried to comprehend what had occurred. The plague had struck with a swiftness that left little room for preparation or recovery. Those who had once shared space, labor, and homes now found themselves faced with isolation and loss. The medieval world, already fragile in its structure, was beginning to show signs of irreparable damage. But as the dead were buried and the world around them seemed to change irrevocably, something else began to unfold, something that no one could have anticipated. The survivors were not simply left with an empty world, they were left with the task of rebuilding what had been lost, even as the ghost of the Black Death lingered on. At the height of the pandemic, entire communities were decimated. Towns and villages that had once thrived with activity were now silent graveyards, their streets empty, their houses abandoned. The death rate was staggering. Some areas of Europe saw up to 60% or more of their populations wiped out in a matter of months. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London were particularly hard hit, with dense populations becoming vulnerable to the disease's rapid spread. It was a brutal, unrelenting force, and in many places there were simply no resources left to bury the dead. Mass graves were dug, sometimes hastily and without ceremony, as the bodies piled up faster than they could be disposed of. In some areas, the dead were left in the streets, unattended, as fear of contagion and confusion gripped the survivors. But in the midst of this, there were still attempts at order. In some cities, authorities tried to establish quarantine measures, though their understanding of disease transmission was rudimentary at best. The concept of isolating those who were sick or suspected of being sick was introduced, but it was too late to prevent the plague's reach. The damage had already been done, and the social and economic systems that had held medieval society together were beginning to crumble. One of the most profound effects of the Black Death was the breakdown of the social structures that had defined life for centuries. The feudal system, which had once been the cornerstone of European society, was rapidly being undermined. In many regions, with a massive portion of the population gone, the surviving peasants and laborers found themselves in a position of unexpected power. With so many dead, there was a critical shortage of workers to tend the fields, care for the land, or manage the day-to-day operations of the estates. For the first time, the surviving peasantry was in demand, and this shift created a new dynamic between workers and landowners. Some peasants, emboldened by the scarcity of labor, began to demand higher wages, better living conditions, or even the right to leave the land they had once been bound to. In response, some nobles, desperate to maintain their control, attempted to rein in these new demands. Laws were passed in places like England and France that sought to prevent workers from migrating, thus controlling the labor force and keeping wages down. But these efforts were met with resistance, and in many regions, peasant revolts began to stir. This was a turning point, a moment in history when the rigid structure of feudalism began to unravel. The Black Death had exposed the fragility of the old system, and the survivors were beginning to sense that they might have more power than they had ever imagined. At the heart of medieval society lay the Catholic Church, which provided both spiritual guidance and social structure. In a time of crisis, people turned to the church for answers, hoping that their faith would provide solace in the face of this unprecedented tragedy. But instead of offering comfort, the church found itself in a crisis of its own. It was powerless to explain or stop the plague, and its inability to provide answers led to a deepening sense of disillusionment among many people. Many Europeans believed that the plague was a punishment from God, a divine retribution for sin. The church, which had long been the intermediary between man and the divine, was suddenly questioned. If God was so powerful, why had he allowed such suffering to befall his people? The uncertainty surrounding the church's inability to offer any effective solution to the plague gave rise to religious extremism, superstition, and blame. In some regions, mass pilgrimages were undertaken in the hope of finding divine intervention, but the plague continued unabated. In other areas, religious groups emerged, claiming to have the power to end the plague. One notable example was the Flagellants, a group of self-flagellating penitents who believed that by whipping themselves in public, they could atone for the sins of mankind and bring an end to the pestilence. But as the death toll continued to climb, even these measures proved ineffective. In many ways, The Black Death marked the beginning of a slow decline in the Church's authority. As people struggled with the overwhelming loss and grief, they began to question the very institutions that had once held their society together. With no clear answers to explain the plague, fear and superstition began to take root. People looked for scapegoats, individuals or groups they could blame for the catastrophe that had befallen them. In many parts of Europe, the Jewish population was blamed for poisoning the wells and causing the plague, leading to violent pogroms and massacres. Entire Jewish communities were burned alive, driven from their homes, or murdered in cold blood. These scapegoating efforts were fueled by a combination of long-standing anti-Semitic sentiments, fear, and religious hysteria. In addition to Jews, other marginalized groups, such as foreigners and lepers, were also blamed for the plague. The belief that some evil force, whether human or supernatural, was responsible for the death toll contributed to the widespread fear. In an attempt to explain the unexplainable, people turned away from reason and embraced the comfort of conspiracy theories and mystical explanations. But for many, the real threat lay not in these scapegoats, but in the very real and invisible enemy, the plague itself, which had no regard for social standing, wealth, or position. By the end of 1347, the plague had made its way into the heart of Europe, where it continued its relentless march. The Mediterranean ports were the first to suffer, but soon the disease had spread throughout France, Spain, and the Low Countries. The great trading cities of Europe, like Venice, Genoa, and Florence, felt the full brunt of the disease. The dense populations, the frequent trade, and the interconnectedness of these cities made them especially vulnerable. In Florence, it is estimated that more than half of the population perished in the span of just a few months. The city, once filled with the vibrancy of art, culture, and commerce, became a place of dread. The famed canals of Venice, which had long been a symbol of the city's wealth and power, were now silent, their waters stagnant with the absence of commerce. Genoa and Marseille were also hard hit. The plague had transformed Europe from a flourishing hub of trade and culture into a fragmented collection of isolated and terrified regions. By the time the first waves of the Black Death had subsided, it was late 1349. The ravages of the plague had been felt across nearly all of Europe, with some regions already seeing the worst of its effects. However, the damage was not over. The psychological toll on the survivors, the physical emptiness in the cities and villages, and the deep fractures within European society were only beginning to reveal themselves. The world that had once been known was gone, replaced by a new, unfamiliar landscape. As the survivors emerged from their homes, those who had been fortunate enough to avoid the sickness, they were met with a world that seemed forever changed. The once bustling markets of Florence, the lively streets of Paris, and the grand squares of Venice were now eerily quiet. The trade routes that had once been filled with the comings and goings of merchants were disrupted, and travel between cities became dangerous and uncertain. But amidst the silence and the grief, something else began to stir. The survivors, though battered, were not without hope. In this desolate world, they would rebuild, but the path to recovery would not be simple. The survivors of the plague were left with overwhelming grief. Families had been torn apart. Many who had lived together for years were now scattered in death. In some cases, entire families perished in the span of days or weeks. The emotional toll was staggering. Parents who had lost children, children who had lost parents, and spouses who had been separated by death, each was left with the haunting emptiness of what had been lost. In rural areas, communities were often left with no one to tend the land. The surviving workers were left to handle what had once been a large farm with only a fraction of the labor force. Many fields were left untended, livestock perished from neglect, and entire villages were abandoned. Yet in the cities, life slowly began to take root again. With much of the population gone, the survivors, sometimes from neighboring towns or different regions, began to migrate in search of safety and stability. Those who had lost everything sought new beginnings in new places, hoping to escape the devastating impact of the plague. As they moved into the empty homes and villages, they began the long and painstaking process of rebuilding. The economic consequences of the Black Death were profound. The dramatic reduction in population created a shortage of labor that affected virtually every aspect of society. For centuries, Europe had been dependent on a feudal system in which peasants and serfs worked the land, producing food and goods for the wealthy landowners. With the loss of so many workers, the production of food and other essential goods plummeted. Fields that had once been fertile lay fallow, and crops rotted in the ground. In the cities, trade, which had once thrived, came to a halt. Merchants, who depended on a reliable workforce, found their businesses struggling to survive. Ships that once sailed across the Mediterranean and the North Sea sat idle in port. Without a reliable labor force, cities could not maintain their vibrancy, and the once thriving economy of Europe was now on the verge of collapse. At the same time, the few surviving laborers now found themselves in an unprecedented position of power. No longer bound by the constraints of feudalism, many peasants found they could demand higher wages for their work. In some regions, especially in England, peasants revolted, protesting for better wages and conditions. They were emboldened by the realization that they were now essential to the functioning of society. In England, the government's attempts to impose restrictions on wages through the Statute of Labourers in 1351 only fueled the fire of discontent. The nobles and landowners, unable to cope with the rapid changes, found themselves unable to reassert the rigid social order that had existed before the plague. The peasants' growing demands for better treatment and wages challenged the foundations of feudal society and hinted at the emerging cracks in the medieval world order. As the surviving labor force began to assert itself, the economic landscape of Europe began to shift. In many places, the old feudal system began to falter. Landlords and nobles who had once held unassailable power over their peasants found themselves in a weakened position. In regions where the plague had taken the heaviest toll, a new economic reality was emerging. Land became more valuable, as fewer people were available to work it. Peasants, who had once been bound to the land by feudal obligations, now found they could demand rents and wages from their former masters. As people began to migrate in search of work, landlords had no choice but to offer better conditions to attract labor. The decline of feudalism was a slow and uneven process, but it had already begun. With fewer workers to cultivate the land, many rural areas saw an increase in the value of labor. In cities, as populations rebounded, workers began to organize in ways that had not been seen before. Craft guilds, which had long been a part of urban life, began to grow in power, giving artisans and laborers a stronger voice in shaping their own futures. The Catholic Church, which had once been the central pillar of European life, also experienced a profound crisis in the wake of the Black Death. For centuries, the Church had been the unifying force of Europe, offering spiritual guidance, moral authority, and answers to the many uncertainties of life. But in the face of the plague, the Church's inability to prevent or explain the disaster led many to question its power and authority. The Black Death had shattered the idea that the Church could protect people from divine wrath. Many began to question the efficacy of the Church's rituals, prayers, and intercession. If the Church's spiritual guidance could not shield Europe from this cataclysm, then what could? In the years following the plague, the Church began to see a decline in its influence over the lives of ordinary people. Some clergy members, unable to cope with the overwhelming death toll, fled their parishes, leaving their communities without spiritual leadership. Others, filled with guilt and uncertainty, sought solace in new forms of spirituality, or even turned to mysticism. The loss of trust in the Church was compounded by the rise of alternative religious movements. New sects and groups emerged, some rejecting the authority of the Pope and the hierarchy of the Church altogether. This period saw the beginnings of what would eventually become the Reformation, a series of religious upheavals that would forever change the landscape of Europe. The psychological toll of the Black Death was also immense. For many survivors, the trauma of losing loved ones, friends, and entire communities had a profound and lasting effect on their worldview. In a society already steeped in religious faith, the plague raised existential questions that would not easily be answered. The collective grief that enveloped Europe led to a profound sense of despair. People began to look at the world around them and wonder what, if anything, could make sense of such suffering. The medieval worldview, which had been grounded in the belief that life was a test of one's faith and that suffering had divine meaning, was deeply shaken by the indiscriminate nature of the Black Death. Many survivors turned inward, seeking solace in prayer or in the pursuit of knowledge. Others turned to art and literature to express their pain. In the wake of the plague, new artistic movements emerged, and literature began to reflect a darker, more introspective view of life and death. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe had begun to take its first hesitant steps toward recovery. The Black Death had irrevocably changed the face of the continent, leaving behind a landscape of shattered societies, empty villages, and a profound sense of loss. Yet, as the years passed, Europe began to rebuild not just its cities and towns, but its very worldview. The survivors, though scarred by the trauma of the plague, were now living in a world that was vastly different from the one they had known before. They faced a new reality, a world where the old systems had been disrupted and new possibilities had emerged. But the scars of the Black Death ran deep, and rebuilding would require more than just physical labor. It would require a fundamental shift in how people thought about life, death, and their place in the world. The road ahead was long, but the seeds of a new Europe, one that would eventually give birth to the Renaissance, were already beginning to take root. One of the most profound shifts to emerge from the ashes of the Black Death was a new intellectual movement, humanism. In the aftermath of such overwhelming death, people began to turn inward and question the nature of human existence. For centuries, medieval Europe had been dominated by religious thought, which emphasized the transient nature of earthly life and the importance of preparing for the afterlife. But now, in a world where so much had been lost, people began to reconsider the value of life on Earth itself. Humanism focused on the potential of human beings and the importance of human experience. It celebrated the idea that individuals could shape their own destinies rather than being entirely subject to divine will or fate. This shift in thinking would lay the intellectual foundations for the Renaissance, a period of great artistic, philosophical, and scientific advancements that would forever alter the course of European history. The early humanists, many of whom were scholars, poets, and philosophers, began to look back to the classical texts of ancient Greece and Rome. They sought to revive the study of these works, believing that by reconnecting with the wisdom of the ancients, Europe could build a brighter future. Writers like Petrarch, who is often called the father of humanism, began to explore themes of individual potential, the importance of reason, and the beauty of human experience. His work inspired many others, and slowly, the seeds of the Renaissance began to take root. As humanism spread across Europe, it also began to influence the realm of art. In the years following the Black Death, artists began to experiment with new techniques, inspired by the rediscovery of classical ideals. The plague had left a void in many aspects of life, but art would prove to be a means of filling that void, offering people a way to make sense of the chaos and find meaning in a world that had been forever altered. In Italy, particularly in Florence, a city that had suffered greatly during the plague, the first sparks of the Renaissance began to emerge. Artists like Giotto, whose works predated the full Renaissance but contained early glimpses of its ideals, began to explore more naturalistic representations of the human form. No longer bound by the rigid, stylized depictions that had characterized medieval art, they began to depict the human body with greater accuracy and emotion. By the early 15th century, artists like Donatello and Masaccio were pushing the boundaries of what was possible in art, creating works that celebrated the beauty and complexity of the human figure. And then, of course, came the great names of the Renaissance: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, who would elevate art to unprecedented heights, creating masterpieces that continue to inspire awe to this day. The emergence of this new artistic vision was not just a revival of classical techniques, it was a reflection of the changing values of the time. As people began to look at the world differently, so too did they begin to look at themselves differently. The individual, once seen as insignificant in the face of divine will, was now celebrated as a central figure in the narrative of human history. While the cultural and intellectual changes of the Renaissance were unfolding in the cities, Europe's rural landscape was also undergoing transformation. The Black Death had decimated the peasant population, leaving vast stretches of land untended. But as the population began to recover, new agricultural techniques and tools began to emerge, leading to a revolution in farming. In the wake of the plague, there was a notable shift toward more efficient and productive forms of agriculture. With fewer workers available, landowners and farmers had to find ways to make the most of their labor. This led to innovations in crop rotation, which improved soil fertility, and the introduction of new plowing techniques that made the work easier and more efficient. The use of the three-field system, where land was divided into 3 parts, with one part left fallow each season, became more widespread, allowing farmers to maximize their yields. At the same time, new technologies in the fields of trade and manufacturing began to take hold. The growing demand for goods, fueled by population recovery, led to innovations in craftsmanship and the development of early industries. Textile production, for example, expanded dramatically, particularly in cities like Bruges and Flanders, which had been major centers of wool trade. This period also saw the beginnings of more complex financial systems. Banks, which had been a part of Europe for centuries, grew in sophistication, and new forms of credit were established. The rise of trade fairs, markets, and the expansion of merchant networks across Europe helped lay the groundwork for the commercial revolution that would follow. While the cultural and economic shifts of the Renaissance were unfolding, the political landscape of Europe was also changing. The feudal system that had defined European governance for centuries was beginning to weaken. The Black Death, by drastically reducing the population, had undermined the power of the feudal lords, who relied on a large labor force to maintain control over their lands. In the aftermath of the plague, monarchs began to consolidate power and centralize authority. In England, the monarchy under the Plantagenets and later the Tudors took advantage of the weakening feudal system to assert greater control over their kingdom. In France, the Valois dynasty used the crisis to strengthen the monarchy and centralize power in the hands of the king. As the nobility lost its grip on power, new forms of government began to take shape. In some regions, such as Italy, the rise of powerful city-states, like Venice and Florence, created new forms of governance. In others, monarchs began to expand their influence, creating the early foundations of the modern nation-state. The religious upheaval caused by the Black Death continued to reverberate across Europe long after the plague had passed. Many survivors, disillusioned with the Church's inability to prevent the catastrophe, began to question the very foundations of religious authority. The questioning of the Church's role in society grew as more people sought answers beyond the traditional doctrines. The Catholic Church, which had been the central institution of medieval Europe, found itself in a position of weakness. The years following the plague saw the emergence of various religious movements, some of which sought to reform the Church from within, while others called for a complete break from Rome's authority. These movements were the precursors to the Protestant Reformation, which would shake Europe to its core in the following centuries. One of the most significant consequences of the Black Death was the way it prepared the ground for religious change. The rise of individualism and the questioning of traditional authority that characterized the Renaissance also laid the intellectual groundwork for the Reformation, as people began to challenge the Church's monopoly on spiritual truth. As the centuries turned, the memory of the Black Death lingered in the hearts and minds of those who lived in its aftermath. The world had changed irrevocably, and with each passing decade, new forces began to shape the destiny of Europe. From the ashes of devastation, human curiosity and resilience flourished. A hunger for knowledge, fueled by both necessity and ambition, led people to question old traditions and search for new answers. Medicine, long bound by superstition and ancient texts, began to evolve. Trade, once confined to local markets, now stretched across continents. Exploration, driven by a thirst for expansion, sent ships into the unknown. The world was awakening to a new era, one that would forever redefine the course of human history. In the centuries before the Black Death, medicine in Europe was largely dictated by ancient texts, particularly those of Galen and Hippocrates. Physicians relied on the theory of humors, believing that an imbalance in bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was the cause of all illness. Treatment often consisted of bloodletting, herbal remedies, and prayers. But when the plague struck, it defied every known medical theory. No treatment proved effective. No prayer could halt its spread. The devastation was so complete that it forced people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about health and disease. In the years that followed, medical practitioners began to seek answers beyond tradition. The old texts were not discarded entirely, but they were now questioned, analyzed, and tested against new observations. Physicians began documenting symptoms, tracking the spread of disease, and theorizing about possible methods of prevention. One such individual was Girolamo Fracastoro, an Italian physician who, in the early 16th century, proposed that diseases were spread by invisible seeds, an astonishingly early hypothesis about germs that predated germ theory by centuries. Though his ideas were not widely accepted at the time, they hinted at the scientific revolution that was beginning to take shape. Alongside these advancements, public health also became a growing concern. Governments began to enforce quarantine measures, isolating ships before allowing them to dock. Entire neighborhoods were sometimes sealed off, preventing the movement of infected individuals. Though imperfect, these methods represented a shift towards systematic disease control, paving the way for modern epidemiology. One of the most transformative inventions of this time was the printing press, developed by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century. Before the printing press, books were painstakingly copied by hand, making them rare and expensive. Knowledge was restricted to those who had access to monastic libraries or the wealth to commission manuscripts. But with Gutenberg's invention, knowledge could be replicated and shared on an unprecedented scale. Suddenly, ideas could travel across Europe faster than ever before. Scientific discoveries, philosophical debates, and political treatises reached a wider audience, fueling the Renaissance and the Reformation. This explosion of information set the stage for an even greater shift, the expansion of European influence across the globe. As Europe recovered from the devastation of the plague, new opportunities emerged. The economic shifts caused by the loss of life had led to the rise of a merchant class eager for new opportunities. The decline of feudalism had allowed for more centralized states that could fund large-scale expeditions, and the increasing desire for knowledge, sparked by the Renaissance, made people more willing to venture into the unknown. The Portuguese and Spanish were among the first to embark on these ambitious voyages. With the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portugal pioneered exploration along the coast of Africa, seeking new trade routes to the east. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, would cross the Atlantic and land in the Americas, ushering in a new era of global interaction. The world was no longer a series of isolated regions. It was becoming a connected, interdependent network of cultures, trade, and ideas. This connection between the old and new worlds brought profound change. The Columbian Exchange, as it came to be known, was the vast transfer of plants, animals, and ideas between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Potatoes, tomatoes, and maize from the New World would revolutionize European diets. In return, horses, wheat, and sugar flowed into the Americas, reshaping indigenous ways of life. But with this exchange came devastation. European diseases, smallpox, measles, and influenza, spread rapidly among indigenous populations, causing mortality rates that rivaled the worst days of the Black Death. Just as the plague had reshaped Europe, these new diseases reshaped the Americas, leading to societal collapses and cultural transformations. The Black Death had not only spurred advancements in medicine and exploration, it had also encouraged people to question the nature of reality itself. Throughout the Renaissance, thinkers began applying logic and observation to the mysteries of the universe. Nicholas Copernicus challenged the geocentric model of the cosmos, proposing that the Earth orbited the Sun. Galileo Galilei would later refine this theory, using the newly invented telescope to observe celestial bodies in greater detail than ever before. Meanwhile, Isaac Newton, building on the work of his predecessors, formulated the laws of motion and gravity, laying the foundations for modern physics. This explosion of scientific thought was deeply rooted in the changes wrought by the Black Death. The loss of faith in traditional institutions, the questioning of long-held beliefs, and the drive for empirical observation all traced back to the crisis that had shaken Europe centuries earlier. Even as the world advanced, the psychological scars of the Black Death endured. The collective trauma of the plague left a mark on art, literature, and philosophy. Paintings from the post-plague period often depicted grim, haunting imagery, reflecting the fragility of human life. Skeletons danced across frescoes in the eerie Danse Macabre, a symbolic reminder that death spared no one, regardless of wealth or status. Philosophers, too, wrestled with the implications of the plague. Some, like Michel de Montaigne, explored themes of existential uncertainty, while others embraced hedonism, believing that life was fleeting and should be enjoyed to the fullest. The Black Death was more than a historical event. It was a turning point in human civilization. What began as a devastating epidemic in the 14th century rippled outward, altering the very foundations of society, governance, economics, and human thought. The world that emerged from the ashes was fundamentally different, shaped not only by those who had perished, but also by those who had survived. Even as the initial outbreak faded into memory, subsequent waves of plague and disease continued to redefine the course of history. Over time, the fears, innovations, and societal shifts that arose in response to the plague evolved, leaving their mark on the modern world in ways that remain visible today. In this final chapter, we explore the enduring legacy of the Black Death, tracing its echoes through centuries of cultural, philosophical, scientific, and political transformation. For those who lived through the Black Death, the psychological scars were deep and lasting. Entire communities had been wiped out, families torn apart, and entire ways of life dismantled. Such profound trauma left its mark on the collective human psyche, influencing everything from literature and art to religious beliefs and cultural attitudes toward life and death. One of the most enduring consequences of the plague was the shift in attitudes toward mortality. The concept of memento mori, a reminder of life's fleeting nature, became a central theme in European culture. Paintings, manuscripts, and sculptures depicted death as an omnipresent force, a stark contrast to the earlier medieval view of life as a preparation for eternity. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, emerged as a powerful artistic motif, portraying skeletons leading kings, peasants, and clergy alike in an unending march toward the grave. Yet, alongside this preoccupation with death, there also arose a new appreciation for life itself. The Renaissance, which flourished in the decades following the plague, reflected an invigorated focus on human potential, creativity, and intellectual exploration. The survivors of the Black Death had witnessed how fragile existence could be, and many sought to make the most of the time they had. This shift would go on to influence movements like the Age of Enlightenment, where the questioning of old structures and the pursuit of knowledge became the defining ideals of a new era. The psychological impact of mass trauma also had a lasting effect on storytelling and folklore. Before the Black Death, medieval literature was largely centered around religious allegory, chivalric romance, and moral instruction. However, after the plague, literature began to reflect themes of fatalism, survival, and human frailty. Stories such as Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron, which was written as a reaction to the plague, provided both entertainment and a coping mechanism for those trying to process the devastation. Over the centuries, literature, poetry, and theater continued to explore the themes of loss, resilience, and the fragility of human existence. Shakespeare's plays, written during an era of recurrent plague outbreaks in England, are filled with references to disease, death, and the precarious nature of power and fate. The shift in consciousness following the Black Death also influenced the emergence of existential philosophy centuries later. Thinkers such as Blaise Pascal, Søren Kierkegaard, and eventually Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus explored ideas of suffering, meaning, and the absurdity of human existence. The echoes of the pandemic's psychological toll resonated through these philosophical explorations, shaping modern views on mortality and purpose. One of the most profound social consequences of the Black Death was the decline of feudalism. Before the plague, medieval Europe had been structured around a rigid system of land ownership, with peasants tied to the land under the control of noble lords. The labor force was vast, and power was concentrated in the hands of the aristocracy. But when the Black Death wiped out nearly half the population, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Suddenly, labor was in short supply, and peasants found themselves with greater leverage than ever before. With fewer workers available, wages rose, and many peasants were able to demand better conditions or even leave their feudal obligations in search of better opportunities. This newfound autonomy weakened the grip of the feudal system. As serfdom declined, a more mobile and independent workforce emerged, fueling the growth of cities and the expansion of commerce. Monarchs seeking to consolidate their own power began to centralize governance, laying the groundwork for the rise of the modern nation-state. The echoes of this transformation are still felt today. The shift away from feudal structures set the stage for democratic ideals, labor rights, and the economic models that underpin contemporary societies. A particularly interesting consequence was the eventual rise of constitutional governance. In England, for example, the social changes brought about by the Black Death contributed to tensions that would later result in documents like the Magna Carta, which placed limits on royal authority. In France and other parts of Europe, similar movements toward representative governance began to take shape, though they would take centuries to fully mature. Additionally, the economic consequences of the Black Death laid the foundation for colonial expansion. As European nations sought new sources of wealth and labor, they turned their attention overseas. The Age of Exploration, which followed in the 15th and 16th centuries, was driven in part by the economic shifts brought about by the plague. The Black Death also indirectly led to modern welfare policies. The drastic loss of life made it clear that societies needed stronger social structures to care for the vulnerable. Early forms of public health policies, poor relief programs, and labor protections can be traced back to the upheaval caused by the pandemic. The Black Death was not only a biological catastrophe, but also a spiritual crisis. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the dominant force in Europe, its authority unquestioned. But when the plague struck, the Church's inability to stop the suffering led many to question its role in society. Priests and monks, who had traditionally served as spiritual guides and healers, were just as vulnerable to the plague as commoners. Many died in great numbers, leaving a vacuum of leadership. Meanwhile, others sought refuge from the horrors of the world in religious extremism, engaging in self-flagellation or blaming marginalized groups for the catastrophe. Yet rather than reinforcing faith, the trauma of the plague often led to doubt and disillusionment. If the plague was divine punishment, why had so many innocent lives been lost? If the Church held the power of intercession, why had its prayers failed? These questions laid the groundwork for one of the most significant religious upheavals in history, the Protestant Reformation. By the 16th century, Figures like Martin Luther would challenge the authority of the Catholic Church, calling for reforms and ultimately reshaping the religious landscape of Europe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the content, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.